Dawn bells braided the air above San Lazaro, and light spilled across the pale yellow face of the Palacios Diager mansion, as though it were a reliquary whose hinges had begun to loosen. The servants moved in their quiet choreography, fires coaxed awake in the kitchen, water set to warm, fresh bread rising in the scent of yeast and ambition, while the city beyond, still the pride of a distant crown, laid out its avenues like burnished ribbon toward the bay. In that hour before the city's heat grew officious and the flies inquisitive, a tremor passed through the household that no one could yet name, only feel. A pause in breath, a hand that lingered a second longer on a doorframe, the click of a rosary bead miscounted. At the chapel, where plaster saints watched the living with the impartiality of stone, only Adriana knelt among the carved pews set aside for the family. Her face held the fragile lucidity of someone who has slept with her eyes open. The priest, Father Tomas Calderon, glanced toward the places where the Marquesa and her other daughters should have sat, and found their absence like a missing tooth that one cannot stop probing with the tongue. He finished the prayers with haste, and, when the last Amen flattened like dust in the stillness, he stepped down and asked the girl very gently where her mother and sisters had gone. She whispered, not raising her eyes, "The blue room." The blue room had a door with a quiet temper. It yielded without complaint to his hand, and revealed in a strike of August light a tableau that the mind refused to accept at first. 3 women in loose mourning wrappers, their faces composed because the body cannot be, and the unmistakable swell beneath each garment, the tide that no corset could command. Catalina de Aguera Velasco, the widow who wore her authority as naturally as her signet ring, looked at him with a steadiness that only deepened his alarm. Isabella's composure trembled around the eyes. Sophia seemed to have stepped back from her own skin and left the shell to receive their visitor. In the gentle blue of that room, the color of porcelain and diplomacy, something had broken with an audible absence. He said no more than their names. The Marquesa lifted her chin, not in defiance, but in the sparse economy of truth. "Domingo," she said, "the carpenter, the slave. There are words that split a life into before and after." Hearing them, Father Tomas closed his hand over the small cross on his chest, as if it might leap free and defend him from the implications. The law he served gave him a narrow lexicon for human failings: adultery, seduction, assault, each wrapped in its proper penance like a relic in silk. But the faces before him refused such simplifications. The room inhaled. The house, with all its corridors and eyes, seemed suddenly too small to contain what it now knew. The plan, once spoken aloud, arranged itself with the inevitability of grief. There would be no viceroy, no public accounting. The city throbbed with a love for scandal disguised as piety. To feed it would be to feed a fire that would not stop with the Palacios Diager name. Domingo must vanish, sold north perhaps, sent to a mine where daylight kept its distance, a book closed without a bookmark. The births would occur in secrecy. The children would be parceled to loyal households whose gratitude and need could be summoned each quarter with purses and threats. The body returns to its old silhouette. The city forgets. The season resumes. Thus spoke fear in the grammar of logistics. Before any of it, there was the matter of the man himself. The priest went alone to the carpentry shed, following the clean, astringent scent of shavings and linseed, the place where the house's wounds were mended without testimony. Domingo stood with a plane in his hand, coaxing a ribbon of mahogany into a curl that he placed aside with the attention of one who believes order to be a form of prayer. When he turned, he did not bother feigning ignorance. The priest told him what the women had said. The man listened with an alert stillness that the priest would later remember, not as arrogance, but as the final dignity of a person who knows how little of his life belongs to him. "They're lying," Domingo said then, not angrily, not even defensively. He pronounced the words as though they were a measurement completed twice for accuracy, because the truth is worse for them. He spoke the names of men with respectable faces and careful reputations, men who had passed through doors after the hour when society's language became private. He did not embellish. He did not plead. He merely laid the alternative on the table like a well-made joint. This fits. The other cannot. The priest felt himself tilt, not because he knew which version to believe, but because both held a plausibility that made the world's moral grid look suddenly like a child's game scratched in dust. He told the man what would be done: removal, silence, a life erased without the indecency of spectacle. "Will you accept it?" he asked, knowing the obscenity of that verb. "What choice do I have?" the man replied, and in his tone lay a weary intelligence that resisted pity, because pity would suggest a freedom to refuse it. That night, 2 men from the port district came and led Domingo away, in a darkness gentle enough to be mistaken for mercy. The ledger noted a sail. The harbor, which remembered everything and told nothing, noted nothing at all. The rains arrived early that year, as if the sky wished to accelerate all baptisms. They drummed over the tile and forced the servants to raise their voices, and in that sound the mansion became a ship unmoored, its passageways slick, its rooms a chain of cabins where the air tasted of secrecy. The midwife from Callao came obediently at odd hours, her hands clean, her expression practical, her silence ensured by money counted twice. In the Marquesa's chamber, the first child slipped into a world that had no room prepared. A brief cry, strong enough for hope to recognize its voice, then a closing. The priest, who had once believed that the last rites comforted the living because they promised the dead were beyond the reach of harm, found his words sticking, cumbersome as keys for a door now walled over. The infant's features had surprised no one who had allowed the truth to approach. The bundle grew cold in the time it took for a servant to fetch the little box. Isabella brought forth a son whose vigor offended no one. He was sent at dusk to Cusco, swaddled not only in wool, but in the story arranged for him. Adriana's daughter, born with a look of patient attention, traveled south before the daylight could call her by any name her mother had considered. Sophia labored under a moon surprisingly serene, and delivered twins who announced themselves with the insistence of new clocks. They, too, were divided at once, and conveyed into lives where their likeness would be read as coincidence. The corridor on the 3rd floor grew quiet. Furniture returned to its old places. The blue room reopened, innocently blue. Across the city, the bells kept their honest tally of hours, while the household learned to count other things: coins, letters, the spaces left at a table for one who would not be rejoining them. Sophia failed to come back from the shore where grief had set her. The physicians murmured consumption because the church needed clean categories. But the house, and those who lived within it, knew she had exhaled something she could not reclaim, and had simply followed it. The letters began like the ticking of a mantel clock that no one remembers winding. They arrived respectful and became, over the months, assured. The children required shoes, education, a tutor for arithmetic, a tutor for discretion. The families housing them required consideration for the hazard of gossip, a fee for misrecognitions at Mass. The steward, Tomas Ibarra, a fastidious man who liked a column to balance as purely as a scale, saw a pattern in the ledger that spoke in quarter notes and called it by its name. He confronted the Marquesa, and she told him a portion of the truth, enough to recruit his silence and keep the books. The city's rain withdrew. The heat resumed its residence. For a while the conspiracy felt like a roof repaired after the storm, sound if not beautiful. Then a sketch arrived from Arequipa. The little girl, captured by an honest hand, looked calmly out from the paper with a face that gathered 2 histories at once, and the household learned how a picture could be a demand. Adriana, whose mind, once allowed to breathe, had asked dangerous questions about rents and harvests, and how a man can be inventory, now punished her body for the audacity of having been its own. She wore discomfort beneath her silk, and prayed until her knees recognized the stone. Survival, she told the priest, had become a set of weights no shoulder could distribute. When the knock came, late in the day, when the house rested between the duties of afternoon and the rites of evening, the young man at the threshold carried in his posture both deference and something like verdict. He introduced himself as Carlos Mendesabal, and with courtesy that made all discourtesy seem impossible, explained that he sought his father, Domingo, last recorded in this household in 1803. He had looked where one must look, he said, in ports, in plantations, in mines where men lose their names faster than their teeth. Each archive had given him the same gift: absence. He thanked them for their time. He left. The house breathed. In the night its breathing failed again. Isabella opened the door to him the next day, and, at the sight of his face, which bore in a single composition the mixed grammar of this land, her careful quiet dissolved. Words the family had kept behind their teeth came out like a flood dislodging furniture. Objects must break to pass. Carlos listened without triumph. He had not come for triumph. He laid out his own pages, letters copied by prudent men who never burn anything, testimonies from servants who had been paid to forget but remembered with admirable accuracy the currency and the sum. He asked what he had the right to ask, what they wanted to name as justice. Public truth, the Marquesa argued, would make the children's lives a series of doors that would not open. Private truth had already killed a man and, by a different route, her youngest daughter. If justice were one blade and mercy another, their household had learned to walk between them in a corridor that narrowed with every step. Adriana proposed a compromise that no one could love but everyone could survive. The truth would be written in full and sealed where only those with blood claim could one day break the wax. Restitution would move where it must, and most of all, the children would be permitted to grow unbranded. Carlos, whose face kept stubbornly unlearning and relearning anger as though it were a language that no longer fit his mouth, asked then the question he had not wanted to need. Did the man they cast from their house force himself upon them? There was no word they could choose that would not tear. Isabella said that in a world where her worth had been weighed and bartered like grain, he had looked at her as though she were not a unit of exchange. Adriana said he had allowed her mind to stand upright in a room where it was expected to sit down and keep its ankles together. The Marquesa, who had built her authority on the precise distribution of favor and fear, said she had been a woman in a house full of claims upon her, and he had asked for nothing. None of them said love. All of them said choice, and each felt the law rise up against the word like a wall, insisting that a slave could neither ask nor be asked for what only persons are said to own. The priest watched his categories turn into smoke and wished for a theology with room for the earth. Carlos took the names he required to pursue what remained of his father, and he asked to see the children in the only way that did not break them. He promised silence, but he clarified the object of his mercy. He did not come to protect the women. He came to keep the children uninjured by a truth they had not chosen. Later he returned with the story that had been waiting for him at the edge of the bay, a story the water had kept correctly. 2 men, a small boat, a moon too honest for the work, rocks tied with the diligence of professionals. Domingo had looked at the water as one looks at a letter one has already read, and folded away. They had expected a struggle. He had deprived them of it. Carlos spoke this as one recites a deposition, because if he allowed one extra syllable to soften, it would become a wail. "You are murderers," he said then, not in metaphor, which forgives, but in mechanism, which does not. The women did not protest, or if they did, their protests found no purchase and slid to the floor where the dust absorbed them. "What do you want?" Isabella asked in a voice that had run out of rebellion and learned to borrow its breath from hope. "I want you to live with it," he said, and the words made the room colder. "I will keep my promise to the living. I will visit the children as a friend who cares more than is explainable. I will tell them their father died traveling and that he was a good man. I will leave the full truth in a place where it can ripen without rotting. You will wake with it." After he left, the hours lengthened in the study until the light withdrew and the walls learned to hum with what they were holding. Adriana said she would go to Cusco and enclose her life in stone and prayer. And though the Marquesa told her that walls are not penance, only shelter, Adriana smiled with a new gentleness and replied that she no longer deserved weather. She went, and in the winter of 1811, her body found the exit that her spirit had been drafting for months. Isabella grew particular about locks, as though a well-latched door could keep out memory, and when she died in 1815, the servants said, her face wore an expression they could only describe as relief correctly rendered. The Marquesa continued until 1819, distributing her fortune with a severity that looked from the outside like generosity and from the inside like arithmetic. Hospitals, schools for children whose parentage the city liked to misplace, funds to ease a trade out of human flesh. She declared nothing and confessed everything in coin. Carlos kept his word. The girl in Arequipa grew into a woman whose intelligence found a harbor in the law. She married one of its practitioners and brought to her household a clarity that neither bragged nor bowed. The boy in Trujillo learned the language of ledgers and ships, and money began to affirm what he already suspected about his competence. The twins, raised where affection had been chosen as policy, learned to recognize in the visits of a certain friend a care that had the particular intensity of sorrow. None of them knew the sentence their lives had escaped, and none of them felt the absence as a lack. This is the consolation one must allow the world, that some mercies work best when unremarked. The priest retired to a smaller parish where the light had a different color and the bells did not argue with each other. He tried, in his last years, to write an account that would be honest without being cruel, and found that his pen refused to take sides, sliding always toward the soft place between blame and pity, where judgment becomes a habit rather than a result. He burned his pages in a small iron brazier, the smoke a modest offer to a heaven that prefers its prayers clean. But he left, sealed and witnessed, the documents that told the truth without requiring an audience. He trusted time, which is a more reliable archivist than any clerk. Decades deepened the city. The mansion, once a single statement, became apartments full of small declarations. The carpentry shed was torn down without ceremony, and the blue room endured repainting, like a patient that survives several physicians. In 1872, a scholar with dust on his cuffs and questions on his tongue opened a sealed packet in the ecclesiastical archives and felt the shock pass through him with the chastened thrill of one who has stumbled into a chamber left shut for good reason. He resealed it and wrote a careful note whose language had no verbs that bled. Sensitive materials, Palacios Diager, access by authority or blood. Paper is kind, it does not pursue. The bay continued. It should be said plainly, the water held what it was given. Boats stitched the horizon with their practical thread, the surface bent its light. The depths argued with no one. Somewhere beneath that patient skin, the bones of a man rested among other unlisted archives, their silence a form of accuracy. Above, in the bright and complicated city, children grew into their faces without knowing who had contributed what to their geometry. Women grew old, learning to live beside the rooms inside them that remained closed. A priest died with the shape of a cross in the palm of his hand. A steward finished his last column and felt the numbers at last agree. In the delicate vanishing point where public mercy and private justice failed to intersect, life persisted. It is the scandal of history that the powerful sometimes continue, and the injured sometimes do not, and comfort springs up like grass between stones, neither deserving nor undeserving, simply alive. What remains is the fact that for a span of years, the order of a household, and perhaps of a city, balanced on the unacknowledged life of a man who learned the weight of rocks tied with care, the grief of a girl who could not find her way back to shore, the stubborn attention of a son who refused to let the world rename absence as nothing. If there is atonement, it lives where children laugh without knowing why they are permitted to, and where, on some evenings when the wind comes in from the bay, a woman who has arranged her hair with the precision of a rite pauses by a window and feels, for a breath no longer, her heart pulled toward a sound it cannot call by name.